Australia. His postdoctoral research aims at planning marine protected areas to accommodate fisheries, food security and biodiversity in the Coral Triangle, which is actually a very important global marine ecosystem. This is quite challenging, so I'm going to let him elaborate a little bit more on this. Please join me welcome Dr. Christopher Brown. Thank you.
Is the microphone okay? Let me know if my Australian accent gets too thick. Sometimes it does. So as Daya said, I'm from the Global Change Institute in Australia. Today I'm not actually going to be talking much about my postdoctoral research. I'm going to be talking about some research that followed on from my PhD, and that's around how management can address the impacts of climate change on marine ecosystems. I'm going to address two questions today. One is, are we already seeing impacts of climate change on marine ecosystems? And the second is, if we are seeing impacts, what do we do about them? Before I begin, I wanted to just plug the new Centre of Excellence of Environmental Decisions at the University of Queensland. The reason I'm putting this up is that I expect there's a lot of early career researchers here, and the Centre of Excellence has travel grants for early career researchers to come and visit us for a number of months, so if you're interested, please come and talk to me afterwards or check out the website. And I also want to thank a number of people who've contributed to this talk and the work that goes into today. I also want to thank William Chung, who's not here today, for setting this talk up for me. So it's pretty clear now that anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are causing the world's oceans to warm. And this figure just shows the warming trend over the last 50 years across the globe's oceans. So you can see a lot of red there, so overall the world's oceans are warming. So as ecologists, we're interested in knowing, well, is this having an impact on marine ecosystems and the fisheries that rely on those marine ecosystems? So a few years ago, my PhD supervisor, Anthony Richardson, and Elvira Polachanska, also from Australia, set up an NC's Marine Climate Impacts Working Group with the aim to look at this question about is climate change already impacting the world's oceans? And a bit of background why that's important. Well, first of all, based on physical changes in the oceans, we do expect there to have already been large changes in marine biology. For instance, this figure shows expected shifts in isotherms. So we expect if ectothermic organisms have a preferred temperature that they like to stay in, then they attract the isotherms as the ocean warms, and those isotherms shift towards the poles. And so the red areas on this figure represent areas where there should be poleward shifts in species ranges, which is consistent with global warming and warming of oceans. And the blue areas represent the very small areas where we expect there to be equatorial shifts. So overall, we should be seeing poleward shifts, at least in species ranges in the world's oceans. The other reason for setting up this climate impacts working group is to inform the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so the IPCC is a really important body for setting policy on mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And this was a key figure in the policy summary in the last assessment report. And what it does is it looks at where there's been warming in the world, and then where there have been observations of change across different physical and biological systems. I'll just zoom in on one aspect of that. The review panel found 28,586 observations, terrestrial biological observations, that could be related to climate change. And about 90% of those were in directions that were consistent with climate change. So that's poles, distribution shifts, earlier timing of spring events, those sorts of changes. The review panel only found 85 marine and freshwater biological observations. So this led us to ask, is there a paucity of marine climate impact studies looking at the impacts of climate change on marine life? And as marine scientists, we know that's not true, because we know there's a lot of literature out there on the impacts of climate change on marine life. And so a few reasons that there was this gap in the last assessment report. One was that there's very few people involved with that report, and that barely any of them were marine specialists or marine biological specialists, so they probably missed the literature. Also, a lot of the studies have actually been published since the last assessment report. So the NC's working group set out to try and fill this data gap, and we just published a paper in Nature Climate Change, and I'm going to present some of that work today. So the work aimed to study the influence of global climate change on marine ecosystems. It's specifically what's happened over the last 50 years. So rather than looking at forecasts and predictions, we wanted to look at what evidence is there in observational records that there's already been changed. We looked at the peer-reviewed literature, did a synthesis of that, and we limited ourselves to observational studies at least 19 years in extent. This is to try and get around the issues of separating long-term climate change that we expect to be a result of greenhouse gases from short-term ocean variability. We looked at a number of different variables, including temperature, so warming, increases in ocean acidity, and also decreases in sea ice. We used a number of approaches to summarise results and synthesise results. One was a vote counting approach, and another was a rates of change approach, which I'll explain in a minute. So this figure shows the global distribution of observations in our database. So you can think of an observation as sort of one-time series of a species of a particular trait. So a trait might be phenology or distribution change, might be abundance change, or it might be community change. And overwhelmingly, the changes that have been observed in literature have been reported to be consistent with what we expect under climate change. So about 85% of those were consistent. It's interesting looking at this map because there's obviously large geographic biases in where the impacts of climate change have been studied. So mostly around places where there's a lot of scientists, so the east coast of Australia, Europe and the coast of North America. There's large data gaps in the southern hemisphere and interestingly around the tropics, which is one of the regions we expect to be most impacted by climate change. Now we can divide this data up in a number of different ways. One way is to look at the percentage of observations that are consistent with climate change for a given trait type. So here I've grouped them by abundance. So abundance change that would be consistent with climate change would be an increase in a warmer water species or a decrease in a colder water species. Distribution changes, so that's generally poleward shifts in distributions. Phenological changes. So expect with warming that spring events like plankton blooms and seabird breeding, they would occur earlier with warming because it brings the onset of spring earlier. Demographic changes such as seabird reproductive success, and community changes such as a general shift in communities towards warmer water species. So on this graph you can read the 50% consistent as kind of like the null expectation. So if there are equal numbers of observations that were or were not consistent with climate change, then we expect to get around 50%. So they're all well above 50%, which is what we expect if climate change is impacting biological traits in the world's oceans. You can also divide up observations by different taxa. So one of the interesting things about our study that hasn't really been done in previous studies, particularly terrestrial ones, is that